Our next two speakers have promised to take us on a Hyrule themed journey. I'm hoping to see maybe some green costumes over there, but with Lincoln related techniques. Please welcome to the stage Andrew Northern and Mike Raji.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the wonderful and immersive world of defense evasion and novel attack techniques, or as I like to call it, Hyrule. My name is Andrew Northern, and despite looking a bit like the Tiger King, or maybe even Waluigi, I am in fact a senior security researcher with Proofpoint. And Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
I do not look like the Tiger King, and my name is Mike Raji. I am a principal analyst at Mandy and Google Cloud.
Awesome. So when I think back to my favorite presentations that I've seen over the years, they're ones that always start with telling you right up front exactly what you're going to hear about. So here it is. We're going to be talking about the wonderful LNK file, also known as the shortcut file. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through a little bit about the mechanics of the LNK file, which is really important for the context of what we're going to discuss. Then we're going to go through some of the history that we've seen with the traditional misuse of this type of file. And then we will unveil for the first time a brand new sub-technique that we have dubbed icon smuggling. Then Mike will walk us through where we've seen this in the wild, leveraged by threat actors. And then finally, we'll put a nice little bow on it, and we'll explain to you why you should care, or the so what. So let's jump right in. Okay, so what is a shortcut? I think that we all have a pretty good idea of what a shortcut is, but generally speaking, it's simply an icon that is a link to another file, a program, an application, or a location. But most importantly, and this is very important to the context of what we're talking about, it is a structured data object. And that structure is comprised of these different sections, which are relatively self-evident based upon their name, but we'll talk a little bit about them. If you are an information security enthusiast or a professional, which I presume many of you are if you're listening to this talk, when you think about a shortcut or a link file, LNK file, you're probably thinking of two, maybe three things. The link target ID list, the link info, and then the string data. Behind me, what you see is a bit of pseudocode. And I say it's pseudocode because it's actually represented as binary within this well-structured object. Let's take a look at the first part here. We have the linked target ID list. What this is a serialized list that tells the Windows operating system precisely, step by step, where it will find the object that when you click on that shortcut that you're trying to access. And then below that, you see the link info, which is the exact same information expressed in a string format. And if this sounds redundant, it's because it is. But there's a good reason why both of these exist. And I know that none of us here would ever have deprecated Windows operating systems in our environments, especially not production environments. But if you did, these deprecated older operating systems don't know how to use this new link info attribute here. So this is much like a fail-safe to be able to go back to that link target ID list. There are other small differences between them that are important, such as the ability to use environmental variables or system variables within the pathing. And then finally, we have the string data section. And this is the area where other commands can be put in. These would be commands such as applying flags or any operations that you would want to take place within that target field when you click on it. A legitimate use of this would be if you had a shortcut to Mozilla Firefox and you wanted to clear the cache because maybe you're a web developer and you want to ensure that you're not having any cache problems or anything of that nature. But what we see instead, by and far away, is threat actors are taking this target ID field and they are leveraging it to do what can best be described as a creative, wonderful landscape of many different attack chains. This one single technique, this target ID, this target path, can be exploited, and it opens up opportunity to abuse the rest of the things that you see here. So, who has used this? Where have we seen this? Before I get into this, I think it's really important to give you a little bit of context about my vantage point and the research that I do. I mentioned before that I work for Proofpoint, and something that's really interesting about our data set is that we see pretty much as far left as you possibly can imagine when it comes to that. That means things coming in email, SMS, CASView, various different things. Whereas most reports that you read will be based upon either incident response or pieced together almost like a puzzle after the fact based upon forensic evidence. Instead, I'm seeing the initial access vector, and because of that, I am able to talk in great detail about the sophistication and the nuances of the processes that come along with the abuse of these different techniques. So here's a very basic example. This is Luma Stealer by our good friends 571, and what we see is the LNK file simply has a target path that is pulling down a payload and executing it. That's pretty much as simple as it gets. Then we have our Italian favorite here, where we have a compressed executable in the form of a zip file, and inside of it, our good friend, the shortcut, doing something a little bit more creative using certutil to pull down and to split a payload into pieces that it then can interpret, and then you get that payload on the box. And of course, Venom Rat. And this one's pretty interesting, and the reason why I have this example up here is because I want to show to you that the LNK file is more than just an initial access vector. It can be leveraged in different stages of the attack chain. In this instance, with 2541 in their deployment of Venom Rat, once they have that initial foothold on the box, they're actually using the LNK file to invoke scheduled tasks to maintain persistence. And then, so you can see here that there are other examples where we have dozens and dozens of steps, quite literally, very convoluted attack chains. But the LNK file is undeniably a quiver that is essential, an arrow in the quiver of threat actors that is essential for them to begin these attack chains, especially with the collapse of the macro-based threats that we saw in 2022 because of the changes that Microsoft pushed out. And so on and so forth. So you may be saying to yourself, oh, I really hope he's not going to go through hundreds, maybe even dozens of different examples of this attack chain, because that would be quite boring. And I can assure you that I am not. But what we do see up here are examples of all real-life clusters of threat activity, malware campaigns, and intrusion sets that myself and my fellow researchers at Proofpoint have seen firsthand. Now, I want all of you to look at this list up here, and if you recognize any of the malware up there or any of these threat actors, please raise your hand. All right, take a look around. All right, that's how prevalent the use of LNK files are. But that's not what we're here to talk about today, okay? That's the history. Now we're gonna get on to the exciting stuff, okay? So we're not here to talk about the shell link, the link info, string data. No, we're actually here to talk about a third secret thing. We are here to talk about the extra data section. And the extra data section, although it does sound like a bonus round at a carnival game, it's really not as exciting as one might think. It's generally benign and it has metadata in it, but it does have our good friend here, the icon field. And the icon field, just as its name implies, is actually where we get to choose what icon we want to have. And that means that you get a pretty little icon like our friend here that can replace this otherwise dull and boring piece of paper with an arrow. So the icon field can take two different types of inputs that are valid. And that would be something that comes from a UNC path, a Universal Naming Convention path, which is essentially shorthand for a shared resource, maybe something on a network drive or something that's referenced elsewhere on the network, or a local file. This could be an icon file that is on our desktop, hard drive, so on and so forth. So as attackers, get ready. All we have to do is we have to control the UNC path, put our evil payload there, and profit, right? Wrong. That's not how that works, and we can't do that. Fortunately, Microsoft has some really great controls in place that prevent you from being able to put things in there like HTTPS, myevilserver.payload. You can't, anything that's web hosted. It validates both the file type and it validates the format of what's being put in there. So what do we do as red teamers? What do we do as someone who's trying to model this? What do we do as actual attackers? we go in search of knowledge. And we all know that knowledge is power. And fortunately for us, because of a lawsuit that was brought against Microsoft in 2002, they were compelled to release over 30,000 pages of RFC-like documentation that talks all about the internal protocols for Windows. So we've got all the knowledge that we have here, that we need here. And this one that we have right here represents everything that you could possibly want to know about the LNK, the shortcut format. So what is inside of this absolutely enthralling tomb of knowledge? Quite possibly the worst slide you've seen yet. So let's go ahead and bring this down to the important part. I've highlighted here for you kind of what you need to know. Essentially, you can put in there two different types of strings, one of them being wide or Unicode and the other one just being a basic ASCII string. But the important part about that is that if you add all of that area together, we are left with 780 bytes. 780 bytes of free real estate. You can do whatever you want in there. So what can we do in there? Hold that thought for just a moment. I'm going to do a little demo here for you, but not to anger the demo gods. You may see that I'm not actually doing it, but what I've done instead is I've taken some screenshots of my lab environment. I'm going to walk you through this. So on the left-hand side, we see my trusty friend, my ISE PowerShell environment. It's not an iChart. Don't try to read it. And then on the right, you can see our target directory. Maybe it's the other way around, isn't it? Anyway, we see the target directory. And in the target directory, as you can see, there's nothing up my sleeve. There's no payload there yet. So let's go ahead and blow up this POC for you, and then we're going to go ahead and walk through it step by step. Firstly, we see a really unique name of a payload that I'm going to generate, something that everyone would want to click on, tax return error 2023. And then what we see is in this link icon location is a hyperlink. And you have to remember, I just said that you can't put that in there normally. So this is where it gets fun. This is going to be our payload. And it doesn't have to be a hyperlink. In this instance right here, it's just a stager for me. But 780 bytes, you think about what you can put inside of there. And then I think maybe payload was doing a little bit of heavy lifting. This is actually what the payload is here. It's just a single one-liner to launch calculator, our favorite way to prove that something works. And if you're fast enough, you'll see that that link is probably still up there if you want to steal my code. And then finally, we get down to the target field. And this is what I talked about before where we saw the traditional misuse. But I'm actually quite proud of this because this is a really clever, completely self-contained payload. What we have is when the link icon is clicked, what it does is it finds itself, its location, then it lists all files that are in that location, which is going to be inside of that archive that it's in. Then it filters only to find itself ending in .zip. And then from there, it reads in its own bytes, and it finds that smuggled icon location, and then it goes out, grabs the payload from there, and executes it. Just a single click. That's all it takes. All right, so we went ahead and ran it, and what we have is our payload there. And then when we click on it, I'll hold for applause, please. All right, but really, let's look and see what is really interesting about this. As an incident responder or someone doing forensics, this is actually quite difficult to figure out what's going on. Because if we even just look at the properties on it, yeah, sure, we'll see everything that I said about finding itself, about pulling down the payload, things of that nature. But what you don't see is you don't see that payload. It's not in there for you to find. It's nowhere to be found. Instead, if we click on the change icon, what we see is a hilarious error message from Microsoft where it tries to retroactively tell me that I can't have a payload with HTTPS inside of there. So 780 bytes. What can you put inside of 780 bytes? Personally, I think that the possibilities are endless. All right, Mike, so you want to tell us a little bit about what we've seen in the wild?
I would love to. Thank you, Andrew, for that deep run through. So I want to take you guys back into the history of Hyrule when Ganondorf was a dude that just lived in the desert with a bunch of women and not like a magical boar or like a weird cut yogi dude with one arm. That was sometime around 2022 or 2023, where in the real world, we identified this phishing campaign in the wild at a time I was working at Proofpoint, in the Proofpoint data, dealing every day with emails that were coming in to customers. So this was live data that we were working in. It was an interesting data set. Basically, it was an email that was sent to a government organization in Indonesia, interestingly abusing a government in Indonesia's infrastructure. So really unusual. This kind of led us to the decision to call this UNK Jakarta up front, just because there were a couple of different attribution things that made it a little difficult to understand where it was from. So what were we observing here realistically? We were observing a phishing email that was delivering a particular URL. That URL was infrastructure from government organizations that I mentioned that delivered a zip archive containing the LNK file, as well as the weaponized icon field that Andrew just walked through at length. And from there, it resulted in a particular payload. I believe the payload was Cobalt Strike. So this is kind of what I just walked through. What I do want to focus and double click on here was an interesting LNK file trigger for PowerShell script that was included in the weaponized icon field of that particular LNK file. So not only did the execution of that LNK file result in the PowerShell script that pulled down and executed the malicious payload, the Cobalt Strike stager, it also resulted in a semi-persistence mechanism where it, again, triggered that PowerShell script. So the best I've ever seen, I would say. It was a little circuitous in the way that it was attempting to execute, as well as maintain some of that persistence mechanisms. And the note that I want to make as well is the Lure file name was geographically specific to a particular event that was happening in organizations globally. So particularly good Lure. So the ownership of this, like we said, targeted Indonesian government entities, but some difficult attribution artifacts emerged, like it was mimicking NetEaser mail server, which was very popular in certain countries in Asia. There were also limited use of Chinese characters in some of the URLs, as well as metacode and strings that we were identifying. But there was also a mix of Indonesian language. So at the end of the day, we weren't able to make a definitive attribution statement around this, but there was definitely a lot of smoke that kind of helped us identify a fire. So with that, I'll give it back to Andrew.
Thank you very much. All right, so we've walked through what an LNK file is. We talked about kind of how it works. We saw some of the traditional misuses of it. We unveiled our new technique, and then we talked about where we saw it in the wild. But here's kind of the big question. So what? Why should we care? What is the implication on the threat landscape? How does this change things? How does this impact us as both defenders and researchers and people who are trying to learn about our adversaries and make attribution claims? Oh, that's backwards, isn't it? So I mentioned before that the single field, right, can lead to a variety of different abuses, the traditional target path abuse. Well, when we take a look at an intrusion or perhaps a payload or an initial access vector, we tend to have a little bit of a bias. We think that based upon the attacker's goals, that we have an ideal attack path, a way that they should behave, a way that we can expect them to behave, right? And because of this, we know that there are certain things that they can do, like those different abuses that we saw that target path. And so we start to account for that. All of a sudden, that starts to create some deviation. But what we do have here are choke points. And this is where the bias really comes in, that we start to focus our visibility, monitoring, detection, everything that we're writing right around those choke points, because we say, okay, well, the attacker's probably going to do this, or we're going to definitely see it when they hit this command line, or we're going to see it when they write to disk or things like that. But what in reality happens is once you introduce something like that, the icon field, all of a sudden we're outside the baseball park, right? We don't know what to do. We're missing stuff. We don't have visibility. We don't have alerting. We don't have monitoring. So I challenge you to think about that a bit, that in fact, there maybe are some things that we can be looking out for, that maybe we need to challenge the preconceived notions about what an attacker may or may not do. Now, I said that there were 30,000 pages of this RFC documentation released. To put this another way, when I made this slide deck, it's 460 rich PDF files, thick PDF files, documenting all the Windows protocols that are out there right now in order for them to be compliant. And they're frequently updated as well. You can just go out there on Microsoft's website and find them. And because of this, I am going to assert that I believe that the battle for the control of networks is going to be fought on these endpoints using not the living off the land binaries that we've been talking about for the last few years, but rather the very protocols that are included and written by Microsoft themselves, many of which are complete greenfield that we haven't even begun to look at. I mean, we saw the macros go away, and we saw the way that they started to pivot to more obscure file types. We're going to continue to see that. And even those that we are intimately aware of, we're able to find brand new ways to exploit them. And just like the random objects scattered all over Hyrule, with a little bit of ingenuity, when combined, they can make surprisingly effective weapons. Thank you.
That was a blast, and exactly like you said, we were really honored and had a lot of fun digesting your notes and actually getting that into the next version of Attack. I know Lindsay and I had some fun conversations trying to grep all that, but hopefully we did some justice. Unfortunately, what we publish on the site will not be as artistic. We don't have a lot of room for graphics and whatnot, but really, I think someone used it in Slack. The word was diabolical. Like, awesome. Really interesting stuff. So I do have a couple of questions. I don't want to steal too much of the Q&A time in case anyone out there with something. Oh, over here. I'm just repeating for the online audience. During the proof of concept that you showed with the PowerShell and Calc and our favorite payload, I think it showed explorer.exe as the parent process. Is that always the case, or is there a big variance there?
Yeah, so I mean, there are naturally different ways that you can call the LNK file, and that's what's going to be the difference about the parent-child relationship. And of course, there's going to, yeah, right. And then there's going to be also some opportunities for spoofing there as well.
Yeah, I think we found that the LNK icon field is incredibly versatile. So the idea is that's a question more about the way that you can exploit a Windows host than it is about how you can exploit the icon field. It could be as simple as a URL pulled from the icon field, or it can be a very specific proof of concept like Andrew put together and then ran through PowerShell. So it's really a choose your own adventure once you get into that field and can weaponize it with a builder.
I'm going to selfishly inject my own question here. So I love the way you outlined the timeline of, there was this need for more transparency around the LNK. There was the macro blocking, as we all saw, and this transition to all these different payloads and all this huge pasture of new protocols. Any ideas, advice of are we just going to whack-a-mole our way and trial and error through that list? Or what are, from your experience, seeing that diabolical, ingenuitive approach from adversaries, what can we do from that mitigation perspective? Or is it just triage as many as possible, detect all the things?
Sure. I mean, you're inevitably going to see these large watershed moments where technology vendors make a large decision that's going to redirect threat actors in the landscape and kind of create these deltas of activity. So macros go away. We see the rise of LNK scripts, VBS scripts, these linking scripts that allow the attack chains to continue and execute on a given host. Microsoft is a very rich sort of source for all of that, but there are a large number of vendors making these decisions, trying to make more secure landscapes out of their protocols and very, very broad technology ecosystems that are there. So you hear a lot of people talk about AI as the end of the blue team, now we're so outmatched. But from the operational experience and the experience that Andrew continues to have at Proofpoint, there definitely is a tendency of AI and other sorts of underground forums to create these deltas of shared activity that's directed by the commercial market, as well as if you've ever prompted some of these AI engines to give you an exploit, they're going to kind of bring you back to the same places again and introduce those choke points that Andrew was talking about earlier as well. So I think organically actors are going to lead us down that road, and we're going to continue to identify those choke points to make the most sort of value out of the Defender environment that's possible.
That tracks. That definitely makes sense on the preventative protection side, but just kind of from your, very unique, and like you said, just very far to the left perspective, for a typical enterprise defender, what is their, hey, I can't necessarily predict the future of, is this going to be this field disabled, or was it 780 bytes? Is that minimized? Is that optional? Whatever. Are there any detection ideas at scale, or is this more just a please don't click LNKs, let's try to nuke those at the email gateway, or what is kind of that more practical, just like quick, regular everyday defender advice?
I think breaking the intermediate scripts that you're going to encounter. So anything that's executing on a host from a particular malicious file type that you might identify in an email attachment. So an email attachment has occurred in that's millions and millions and millions a day. A click results in that. And then there are a number of processes that might be executed from that are going to be kind of suspect. Like, why is PowerShell executing from this LNK file I clicked in an email? So identifying and adhering to the attack framework to understand potential malicious activity on a host stemming from email attachments and the particular PIDs that might result and identify that is a really useful way to just get you running. That's basically how we identified that UNK Jakarta cluster, is like, why is PowerShell running from that? It shouldn't be happening. And then from there, we ended up in a new sub technique. So I say start simple and then build from there.
Yeah, that starts to get back to that note about diabolicals. I think even the question earlier, like, so we start chaining that with token manipulation and then memory execution, and this becomes just a whole spiral of a lot of fun times. We do have maybe time for one or two more questions. I see a hand here.
Both techniques that you showed, you demonstrated how link files can be used to call things like schedule tasks, command, or PowerShell. What kind of privilege does the attacker have to have on the box for actually?
So just for the online audience, what are the prereqs regarding privileges regarding, not only maybe execution of the LNK, but the subsequent, chains of activity?
Yeah, so the damage is already done just as a user, right? So if the user can double click it, then the user is able to access any resources that the user otherwise would have access to. So that takes into account other things like, are we on a privileged box? Does the user need to reach out to the internet? Does the user need to be able to run PowerShell? Are you doing enforcing code sign, things of that nature that would maybe prohibit that?
So theoretically, if you lock down the endpoints and maybe the users couldn't call PowerShell or access schedule tasks, you could nip some of this.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement.
And I think that gets back to our note earlier about, the trade-off of being an admin versus not. There's always those usability concerns balanced with security. But yeah, it's probably something that worth a good night of experimentation and see how it works in your environment. Maybe time for one more. Any takers? I know. Oh, in the front.
Thanks a lot for this. I'm curious, like, just from your perspective, what do you see as like sort of the state-of-the-art evasion of the smart screen when it comes to sending phishing links with LNKs? Like, how do adversaries think about possibly evading that, or is it really just simply a matter of like, let's package our LNK into like a container?
The question is, where do you see the kind of next steps innovation within these packaging of different payload types?
Yeah, so I think that ultimately it comes down to the human element, the human factor there, that all of these attacks that we've been talking about do require human interaction, and it requires someone to be fooled. And even if you have a smart screen and they've already been compelled enough to go ahead and click on this, then they're probably going to be like, well, I'm going to click on that as well, right? And there are technical ways to defeat that and also to try to prevent that as well. But I think that's a pretty deep topic.
And as we kind of talked about earlier, you can bury this wherever in the infection chain. We gave demonstrations where it was very close to the top of the infection chain, but in an example like I don't remember the TA number and I don't work there anymore, so I don't have to. More eggs actor that was represented where it's dozens and dozens of infection chains. You can bury that icon field methodology rather deep into that. So it's a versatile thing to utilize as an attacker in your infection chain to get over some speed bumps you might be encountering not at those initial stages.
And again, quick reminder, sub technique will be in the next version of Attack, released Halloween. A small token of our appreciation. Congrats and thank you so much again.
Thank you very much.